together over 23 or so seminars throughout the year on different aspects of the research process, which we try and keep up to date each year. And all of them are enormous topics that we try and cover as an overview in just an hour. And so because of that, you will find additional resources in the back of your handouts that should help you in other areas or extend. And because we video link around Western Australia and also record and upload to our website, could I ask that you keep your questions until the end, and we will run around with a microphone so people here and off-site can also hear. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Sunalene Devadason, who's the Graduate Research Coordinator at UWA and has a long history working in the area of governance and is extremely well placed to be speaking to us all today. So please join me in welcoming Sunalene.
Okay, thanks, Sue. So just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. I'm going to give a couple of examples to illustrate why there's a need for research governance, explain what research governance is all about. I'll go through the process of single ethical review for multi-centre studies and give a few more details of the application review process in WA. And then cover a few points that you might want to consider, a few points and practical tips that you might want to consider when submitting your applications. This slide just has a few abbreviations that might be frequently used. If you're not familiar with any of the terms, you can always refer back to this page in your handout. So why is there a need for research governance? In 2005 in the UK, there was a phase 1 first-in-human trial involving an experimental product. 6 healthy volunteers participated in the study. All 6 ended up with very severe health effects requiring intensive hospitalisation and intensive care, and they've ended up with lifelong health problems. Part of the problem with the way the study was set up is that they didn't monitor the first couple of patients or the first patient for long enough to see whether adverse effects were going to occur before they administered the experimental product to the remaining patients or participants. And in fact, by the time the product was administered to the last participants, the first one had already started showing side effects. So that was the start of the development of a research governance review of research studies. In that particular incident, the cost of the treatment for the formerly healthy participants was covered by the NHS, or the National Health Service in the UK, even though the trial was commercially sponsored. Although the participants had lifelong health effects, they weren't able to get sufficient compensation from the company sponsoring the study because the sponsor went bankrupt and their insurance policy was not large enough to provide this compensation. But this incident explains the current requirements for research governance review, particularly for industry-sponsored studies. A part of the research governance review is to look at study agreements and insurance policies from the sponsors to make sure that the health service is covered. Even though we now have a process of research governance review, in 2016, which was 11 years later, a similar incident has occurred in France. Again, a first-in-human study with healthy participants. All 6 were hospitalised, and in this case, one of the volunteers died. So what is research governance? I've got a couple of definitions from the UK and from Australia. One of the UK definitions is it's a process aimed at ensuring that the research we conduct is of high quality and is safe and ethical. Another definition is that it's a broad range of regulations, principles and standards of good practice that we need in order to achieve and continuously improve research quality across the board. A definition from Australia, from the Australian Clinical Trials website, is that research governance refers to the processes used by institutions to ensure that they are accountable for the research conducted under their auspices. That is, the participants are not undergo research procedures that are safe for them. Because institutions also need to protect themselves, part of the institutional research governance review is to make sure that all the researchers are appropriately credentialed and trained for the procedures they'll be conducting as part of their research studies, and in that way we try to manage institutional risk. So in plain English, I will give you a definition that was from a layperson's handbook to research governance that was prepared by a Sydney medical student. So she says research governance is essentially the way organisations cover themselves and the public to ensure that nobody creates a Dr. Frankenstein. So what's the difference between ethics and governance? In theory, ethical principles apply across the board. So your HREC review should be looking at broadly overarching ethical principles applicable to your research studies. These include research merit and integrity, justice, beneficence, and respect for the participants. If we apply those ethical principles across the board, we can then accept single ethical review for multiple sites, because the HREC that's approving those that research study should be approving it across the board for all sites involved. So in layperson's terms, had Dr. Frankenstein applied for HREC approval, the ethics officer would have told him that body snatching was an ethical no-no and he would need to resubmit his application. So how does research governance differ from this? Research governance is site-specific. So if you're doing a multi-centre study, you will have to apply for site-specific approval for every site. A lot of the examples I'll be using in this talk apply to CAHS, because that's where I've mainly obtained my site-specific approval for my research. So research governance review within a site looks at the policies, regulations and guidelines applicable to that particular site, which might differ in different states and even across different health sites in the same state. Facilities available and costings that apply might also be different at different sites. The lay definitions, so even if Dr. Frankenstein got ethics approval, the research governance officer would have rejected his site-specific assessment application on the grounds that the budget was insufficient to create life. So what are the elements of research governance? The first is that you must have ethical approval. Okay? Even if the ethics and research governance reviews are concurrent, you will not get your site-specific approval until there's evidence of an HREC approval or ethics approval from an appropriately credentialed ethics committee for the research you're conducting. Part of research governance is to ensure that the study is conducted in compliance with relevant legislations, regulations, guidelines and codes of practice. And some of these will differ in WA compared with other states. In some studies, research governance review also involves looking at legal matters such as contracts and the indemnity and insurance frameworks, either from the sponsor or from the site itself. We look at financial management, so that makes sure there's sufficient budgets in order to complete the study, risk management, and look at the facility, the site-specific assessment of the facilities required for the research. There are institutional policies and procedures of responsible research conduct that might differ slightly in terms of training requirements, so that's also reviewed. We look at how the collaborative research is managed and also ensure that the reporting requirements for that research is met. So the underlying principle of research governance is, will the research benefit patients, clinical practice or the community in general? Because there's always a cost to research. If you're involving participants in your project, even if it's if it only involves their time, there's still a cost to them. And so we want to make sure that the research will actually be of benefit. This principle of research governance is not only applicable to studies involving human participants, where you're bringing them in for studies, but also if you wish to access their tissue or data. If there is a commercial sponsor, quite often they restrict the publication and dissemination of the results of the study, and so the outcomes of the study might benefit only the sponsor and their product, but not necessarily be of benefit to patients in general, and so the sponsor must bear the full cost of the research. In WA, we use an online portal called the Research Governance Service, or RGS, and this is the website. I don't know if you can see that. You can't see that. The website is the link in green, and every stage of current projects that are open, that are currently being conducted, should be captured in RGS. So some of you would have submitted applications after the online portal became available, so the entire process of your research has been conducted on RGS, but the studies that were approved prior to the setup of RGS have been migrated onto the system, and so you can submit annual reports and amendments and post-approval monitoring documents on RGS. Those of you who haven't gone on to RGS but have open studies, you will need to go on to RGS to update your study details before you can start submitting annual reports or amendments. There's a support line shown in blue, it's the RGS support at health.wa.gov.au. It's not moving forward. Is Alison around?
There should be someone upstairs helping. This is your button, right?
No, it was that one or that one.
Okay. Bear with me.
Okay. I can't see what's coming up next. Does anyone have any questions while we're waiting? Okay, I can't go on to the following slides because I was actually going to show you what the RGS system looks like on the screen. So, while we're waiting, I can talk about single ethical review in WA. So within, once we set, the online portal was the first step that we needed in order to get single ethical review for multi-centre studies. What that means is if you have a study on different sites, now you shouldn't have to apply to multiple HRECs. You should only, if you choose the correct HREC, you should only have to get a single ethical approval. Okay, and that single ethical approval was initially set up in WA, and now we've moved to a national system. However, you still need to get research governance approval at every site that you're conducting the research in. Single ethical approval in WA at the moment is only available from WA public hospital HRECs. If you're doing a study at Royal Perth, in CAHS and in the South Metropolitan Health Service, or Fiona Stanley, if you choose the right ethics committee, you will be able to only get one HREC approval, but you'll have to get research governance approval across the board. One of the provisos to that is if in some conditions, specialist HREC approvals might be needed. So, for example, if you're doing studies primarily in children, you will need to get approval from an HREC, such as the CAHS HREC, that has paediatric expertise and has been accredited for paediatric expertise. If your research involves data linkage, you would have to apply to the Department of Health HREC, because they're the specialist HREC for data linkage studies. And again, as I mentioned, you need site-specific assessment at every site that you're conducting the research in. As part of single ethical approval, you need 2 approval letters in order to commence your research, not just the HREC approval letter, but you need your governance approval or site-specific approval letter before you can start. That if you've got site-specific approval at one site and your HREC approval, but you don't have the SSA at another site, you can only start your research at the site that you've got the SSA approval for. Site authorisation, as I said, cannot be given until a valid ethics approval letter is submitted to the Research Governance Office. If you're applying for HREC and governance approval in the same site, so say you come to the CAHS HREC and the CAHS Research Governance Office for approval, the assessment of your application can be started concurrently. But you still have to get the HREC letter first before you get the final SSA approval. However, that concurrent review can save you time in the long run. Once we set up single ethical review in WA, we moved on to set up single ethical review across Australia, so that you can get an HREC approval from an appropriately accredited lead HREC within Australia, even in a different state. But I'll let him do this first.
Please carry on.
Yeah, so you can get, if you get approval from an appropriate HREC. Oh, here we go. Thank you.
I just use the space bar.
Okay. So I'll go backwards now. I was. If I go backspace, yeah. So I was telling you about the Research Governance Service, so the next slide moved on from that. This is the website for the online portal where you can start your applications. It has a lot of information on there. You can sign up on the left, and you can even search for other projects, or if you're looking for a researcher with a relevant specialty, you can search for them, and you can search for publications as well. That's on the left. Up the top, there's a research information tab, and that shows you some of the information available. But there's sections with information on the research governance framework within WA, research ethics, specifically research governance, and if you're interested in multi-centre research, there'll be information available there. There's a document template page. This is part of the page that has templates of various documents you might need to submit with your ethics and governance applications, and these might include a research protocol template or a participant information sheet and consent form. There's also a help wiki that has user guides and videos. This is the front page of the Health Wiki, and I'm told that Quick Start user guide for new users is something that people find very useful. There is also the WATN, or the WAHTN, has set up a video as a guide for researchers in the use of RGS, and that's available at the link I've shown. It's part of their research education training program. Okay, I've covered some of this. If you're not unsure of any of it, I can answer questions at the end. I've covered this. I was on to National Mutual Acceptance. So National Mutual Acceptance involving single ethical review across Australia is only available for multi-centre studies, and you need to get that ethical approval from a certified lead HREC with relevant expertise, and the NHMRC has certified those HRECs. If the lead HREC is in another state, so you're doing your research here, but the lead HREC is from another site, you don't use the ethics form on the RGS system. You use a national ethics form called the Human Research Ethics Application, or HRE. However, the HRE doesn't have all the questions we require for WA approval, so you need to also submit a WA-specific module on RGS. You need to upload the HRE form as well, and then you need to apply for your research governance approval for this site on RGS. If the lead HREC is WA-based, but you already have another site that you want to do the research in another state, or if you think you might plan to do the same research project in another state, another site. It's recommended that you still use the HRI, because that applies across Australia. Then you go into RGS, you fill in the WA-specific module, and you do your site-specific assessment for this site. In WA, we only have 3 NHMRC certified HRECs for national mutual acceptance. The information can be found on the website shown there, and the 3 HRECs are the CAHS HREC, the Charles Gardner and Osborne Park HREC, and the South Metropolitan Health Service HREC. So often on health sites we have university researchers or research institute researchers. We also have students working on health sites doing research. So what about the university HRECs? At the moment, university and private HRECs such as Bellbury, their approvals are not accepted as lead HREC approval under the NMA agreement or the single ethical review in WA. So projects that require access to patients or their data or facilities at public hospital sites, no matter who's conducting the research, require the public hospital HREC and governance approvals. Okay. Research students may also need to, who are enrolled at universities, other universities, may also need to meet their university requirements for ethics approval. And in some cases that might mean submitting the public hospital HREC approvals to the university so that the university HREC will recognise the other HREC approvals. In addition, students should be named as study personnel on the approval letters. So a more detailed look at the application review process. The application review process may differ at different sites, so please do check with your relevant HREC and research governance officers at the site you're working at. This is the CAHS flowchart for how your review process should proceed. Once you've submitted your ethics and governance application, it gets reviewed. Quite often you might get feedback separately from the ethics team and the governance team as part of the process. Once you've answered all their queries and met all their requirements, you must first get the HREC approval letter submitted to the research governance office, or the ethics office might submit it to the research governance office for you, and that's when you finally are able to start the project on site, when you've got the 2 arms of the approval in place. So HREC applications require firstly an ethics form, whether it's the WA Health Ethics Application Form available on RGS or the HRI that I mentioned previously, but with the HRI, as I said, you need the WA specific module. Secondly, you need to submit a research protocol that outlines what you're going to do on the study. And you can either use the template available on the RGS website, or you can use any other standard protocol templates, as long as it outlines the study that you're intending to conduct in enough detail. Other application documents may also be needed, may need to be uploaded onto RGS, and these include participant information sheets and consent forms. If your study involves questionnaires, surveys and advertising material, those would need to be uploaded as well. And if there is a conflict of interest between any of the researchers and the sponsor of the study, for example, you will need to declare that conflict of interest as part of your application. The governance form, the standard governance form or the site-specific assessment form on the left applies to almost all applications that are submitted via RGS. There's another form called the WA Health Access Request Form, but that has very limited use. It's only if the study requires access to participants via flyers or posters that you might put up in a clinic. or access to tissue or data only, and the research is not conducted on a WA Health site and will not use WA Health staff, time or resources. So if you're a researcher based off-site, but you would like to recruit participants in a clinic, you might use the WA Health Access Request form under certain conditions, but it will mean that you're not based on the site or using any of the other facilities. The complete application submitted to the ethics team as part of the ethics arm or the ethics reviewed is also reviewed by the Research Governance Office for relevant information. So the Research Governance Officer doesn't only look at the information you've submitted as part of your site-specific assessment, but also looks at the ethics form. So issues for consideration. First of all, some HRECs require, an increasing number of HREC, and that includes CAHS, require evidence of good clinical practice training for not just the investigators but the study personnel before they will approve a study. These are reviewed at the HREC level. There are other specific requirements depending on your research study. There are specific staff training requirements, and these are assessed based on the research protocol that you submit. They look at the procedures you're going to be conducting as part of the research. In CAHS, everyone utilising, for example, our clinic rooms for research studies needs to have completed the CAHS mandatory competencies, including the hospital basic life support and basic life support. Another thing to consider is, are you going to access confidential data? And if so, how are you going to store it? That needs to be included as part of your application. Non-WA health staff, if they need to access patient records, they do need to include a confidentiality agreement as part of their RGS submission. In your protocol or in the application, you need to identify how you will be storing the data and whether the data you require is identifiable or de-identifiable. If you do require access to identifiable data, that must be justified in your research protocol. You also need to declare any actual or perceived conflicts of interest. If your research requires access to other departments or facilities, you need to apply for approval to those departments as well. So if you require access to medical records, you need to get their approval. Same for other departments such as imaging, pharmacy or phlebotomy. Another thing to consider is who will own the intellectual property of the research you're conducting. You need to include details of the recruitment of any participants in your study. That is, who you'll be recruiting, which patient groups, which disease conditions, what you're going to be doing to the participants, what procedures are included in your research, where the research will be conducted, so that the review can include assessment of whether it's safe to conduct those procedures in the area you'll be conducting them. When you'll be conducting the research and how you'll be trying to recruit participants. You also need to identify if you'll be recruiting participants as inpatients when they've been discharged from outpatient clinics or from the community. Who the study sponsor is also important. Please note the word sponsor can be used in different contexts. If you're doing an industry-sponsored study, the company sponsoring the research is considered the sponsor. So sponsor can refer to the funding body that is sponsoring your research, but sponsor can also be used to identify the administering institution that is overseeing your research. The administering institution can be used as a sponsor For this particular form, it's the clinical trial notification form that is submitted to the TGA for some research studies. So the CTN is different from a clinical trials registry. The clinical trials a clinical trials registry is where you can provide details of the research you're doing so that other researchers can see if something similar is already being conducted. The CTN form is specifically used if a drug or device has not already been registered in Australia, but you want to use it for a research study, and it is also used if you use a registered drug or device off-label. So you need to also make sure the drug or device you intend to test or use is used within the approved indications in Australia. If not, you do need to submit a CTN form. The off-label use is especially relevant for studies in children because there are drugs which are registered for use in Australia in adults but are commonly used clinically for off-label for therapy in children. But if you're using those same drugs for a research study, even if they're in common clinical practice, you still need to put in a CTN if it's off-label use in Australia. The CTN is now an online submission. The CTN submission process within CAHS, and it may differ on other sites, it has two parts to it. There's one avenue if CAHS is the sponsor, and there's another if there's an industry or commercial sponsor or a collaborative research group sponsor. So where CAHS is the sponsor, this applies to most investigator-initiated studies. So where a researcher has an idea and they submit a protocol and get approval, but they are the main initiator of the study. And also grant-funded studies, such as NHMRC studies, would mostly be considered investigator-initiated studies. Some collaborative research group studies are also considered, require CAHS to be the sponsor. In this case, the investigator drafts an online CTN and the RGO, Research Governance Office, can provide you with access to the site for the CTN form. Once you draft the CTN, the Research Governance Office will submit the form for you. Once the form is submitted, an invoice is generated because you have to pay the TGA for the CTN. That invoice needs to be paid by the investigator before the TGA will send you a notification letter. You can't get governance approval until that TGA notification letter has been submitted to the Research Governance Office. Okay. However, where there's an industry sponsor or the collaborative research group is willing to be the sponsor of the study, that sponsor is responsible for the whole thing. They're responsible for drafting, submitting, paying the fee for that study. So funding or study agreements, no agreement is required if the research is conducted fully within WA Health using departmental funding. However, that is quite often not the case. The studies are generally more complex, involving funding from outside and researchers from other institutions. So an agreement is usually required if external institutions or funding is involved in the study. However, institutions that we commonly work with, such as universities and research institutes, there may already be an overarching agreement in place. So with certain universities and research institutes, you don't need to have a study agreement, even if you're working with non-WA health researchers. However, depending on the procedures being used and the type of research, some studies, even with these institutions, may still need individual agreements. If your study is being funded by a commercial sponsor, in most cases a WA Health approved agreement is required. If WA Health patients, staff, data, specimens or resources are involved, you will need an agreement. And this applies whether the sponsorship you're getting is monetary, so you're actually getting funding for the study, or if you're getting in-kind support for the study, such as drugs or devices provided by a company, you will generally still need an agreement. And the agreement would need to be signed by a WA Health institutional representative. Within CAHS, it is the Executive Director of Medical Services. If you have an agreement with a company that is based outside Australia, so you have an international sponsor for your research, there must be an Australian entity as part of that research. That entity might be a contract research organisation or might be an Australian office of the international company. There are template agreements available for industry sponsorship, depending on the type of research you're doing. There are also pre-approved templates with some companies between WA Health and that company. So if you're using an overarching template from WA Health or a previously agreed sponsor template, those will go through fairly automatically. Those can be approved fairly automatically. However, if a sponsor provides you with an agreement that does not match a template, there may need to be a legal review of that agreement, which will take additional time. If you submit the non-standard agreement to the Research Governance Office, they will organise the legal review. Insurance. So there are two types of insurance to consider. The insurance of the staff involved in the study personnel, and that will generally have to be covered by the employer or the employing institution, and then insurance for participants. So if the research is conducted fully within WA Health by WA Health staff, without industry sponsorship or IP restrictions, that research study should be covered by risk cover. But that is dependent on the ethics approval or HREC approval is from a CAHS recognised lead HREC, and that is required if you're accessing records or facilities within CAHS. To be insured, students must be listed on the original application of the original HREC applications. If students have come on board the project after the initial ethics approval, their names can be submitted as part of an amendment to the ethics committee. Recognition of existing ethics approvals should also be obtained from the university HRECs where the students are enrolled. Patient indemnity. So the other type of insurance is insurance for the participants involved in studies. The WA Health insurer, risk cover, may cover the study and will do so if the study is fully funded by a competitive granting body like NHMRC or a charitable grant, a grant from a charitable foundation. However, for industry-sponsored studies, the sponsor needs to insure the participants, and the Research Governance Office actually reviews those insurance certificates to make sure that the level and type of insurance are sufficient for the study. There may be exceptions if sponsors do not restrict the use of the data, that is, they don't claim the intellectual property on that study, but that needs to be negotiated on an individual basis. So for the researcher, workplace insurance is required for investigators and study personnel involved in the study, and this is by the employing institution. Students need to be covered by their enrolling institution and may need to submit appropriate documentation to make sure that they're covered. So a few practical tips. You can often get advice while preparing the application or during the review process of that application. But the advice is most applicable or most appropriate if you provide as much information as possible on your application, so that the Research Governance Office or Ethics Officer knows what the full parameters of the study are. The more information you provide, it will help the Research Governance Office determine if an agreement is necessary and which template agreement best suits your study. You can get guidance on insurance requirements, and it's quite difficult to provide comprehensive advice without knowing all the details of a study. If you do need a contract or study agreement for your study and it's not a standard template, you should submit a draft of that agreement as early as possible so that it can be reviewed, as the review process might take some time. One hint that other people have given me is if you're cutting and pasting from previous protocols or previous applications, make sure all the details are applicable to your new study, because it's quite easy when you're editing a document to miss some details that are not relevant to your new research project. Budgets. So WA health forms require detailed budgets to be submitted. You need to provide costing for in-kind and funded support. So basically any funding that's provided by a commercial sponsor or a grant needs to be included in the budget for the study. If anyone is providing you with help without payment, that time component can be included as an in-kind cost. The reason for this is that a detailed costing of different types of research studies are important. It impacts on activity-based funding models, and it also means that the true cost of research can be captured so that investigators planning similar studies in the future don't under-budget their studies. They know what components need to be included in their studies. The other reason it's important to have a proper budget for your studies is it's unethical to commence a study and use participant time or their data and not be able to complete that study so that those results are not usable. When you're costing research, there's some things that people might not think of to include in their budgets. One of those is budgeting for adequate statistical support. Statistical support can be included as in-kind support if it's going to be provided to you for free, but that costing should still go in there. Costing for data management, storage of data, and archiving. So the documents from a research study need to be archived for differing lengths of time depending on the type of study you do. If you're doing studies in children and they're interventional, you will need to archive those documents until the child reaches the age of 25. So you need to include those costs in your budgets. And also the costs of disseminating your research findings, presenting data at conferences, publishing the data, or incorporating those findings into policy or clinical practice. So budget tips, make sure you complete the budget form. If a $0 value is including, saying that research costs nothing rings alarm bells. Include costs that are additional to clinical care. So if you're adding a procedure or an image or adding a little bit of time onto a clinic visit, include that cost, whether it's in kind or funded. If someone is providing you with help, include their salary as an in-kind support. RGS has guidance as to how to calculate these amounts. So include the cost of your time, even if that time is part of your normal duties, and include support provided by other institutions, not just your own. Within RGS, the institutional business manager must sign off on the budget. And if you're using facilities such as clinic rooms, there may be a cost there as well. So the budget might need to be checked by a research nurse manager or equivalent before being submitted. So finally, there's some contacts where you can get more specific advice. The WA Health and Research Governance Office contacts at different sites are included in your handouts and also can be found on the website provided. The CAHS contacts are also provided here. Within CAHS, we've got pre-submission assistance. The general inquiries can go to our research facilitators at the CAHS.researchsupport email address. And for commercial, generally for more commercial trial advice, the Clinical Trials Liaison Officer is Leslie Banfield. Post-submission, so once you've submitted your application and you need assistance with the queries, the Ethics Coordinator and Compliance Officer is Helen Hughes, and the Research Governance Officer is Jenny Westgarth-Taylor. Thank you. There's some adverts for upcoming sessions here, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thanks. And I think Helen Hughes is coming down the front to help with the questions as well.
Thanks, Sunalene.
It's okay.
It's a lot to cover in just an hour. So are there any comments or questions about any of the things Sunalene's spoken to today? It's a fair bit to take on board. There's a microphone right there.
I'm an employee of Telethon Kids, but I'm going to be working on a project that is based in CAHS. We're falling between perhaps the cracks, or not the cracks, that's the wrong word, but like, do we just treat ourselves as a non-WA Health employee in all of the advice that you've given today?
It depends on the study you're doing and the facilities you're using.
Yeah, normally it would be your employer, so you'd have to look at who's sponsoring the research, who's conducting the research, and the first point of call for you would be the TKI governance team to confirm what they require for you to do that work.
Yeah.
That's good.
No other comments or questions? Well, hopefully you've got a handle on how important, firstly, this area is, and also that there is a lot of help available. No matter where you work, there'll be an ethics and governance support system that can help guide you through the process, and of course the RGS as well. If there are no further comments and questions, I'm sure Sunalene would be happy to stay behind for a little while if anyone wants to talk offline. But otherwise, please take a moment to fill in your evaluation form, which is just at the back of your handout. And please join me in thanking Sunalene, who coped very well with the technical hitch